Hello, and welcome to Fort Ticonderoga, one of North America's most historic landscapes. Our story spans centuries, reflecting the people and the conflicts that have shaped our nation and North America.
Ticonderoga takes its name from an Iroquoian word meaning a place between two waters, describing this important place between Lake Champlain and Lake George. Artifacts recovered from here show evidence of human activity dating back over 12,000 years. Since then, Ticonderoga's place on the interior waterways of North America has made it a point of contact and conflict for centuries. The region's first documented military encounter occurred in 1609. A Native American war party with 3 Frenchmen in tow, including Samuel de Champlain, who recorded the events, met their enemies, a group of Haudenosaunee, on Ticonderoga's shores. In the engagement that followed, Champlain and his French compatriots opened fire with their firearms, ushering in a new era of warfare on the North American continent. The European invasion and the introduction of these new weapons changed North America forever and exacerbated cycles of violence that continued throughout the colonial period. These conflicts culminated in the middle of the 18th century as the French and Indian War began. On October 12, 1755, Michel Chartier de Lotbinière, a Canadian-born engineer, arrived at Ticonderoga to survey the wooded peninsula and begin to lay out a fortification that would dominate strategic thinking in the Champlain Valley and North America for over 2.5 decades. The barracks of this fort, eventually referred to as Fort Guérin, were originally constructed of wood until stone, made available by cutting into the bedrock that forms the Ticonderoga Peninsula, allowed for the construction of stone outerworks and barracks. Some parts of the masonry still stand to this day. Fort Guérin became the front line of New France. It was from here that the French assembled their army, including the largest Native American military force of the 18th century, to launch their successful attack on Fort William Henry in August of 1757. The following year, in July of 1758, a 16,000-strong British and American force under General James Abercrombie went on the offensive against Fort Carillon, clogging Lake George with hundreds of vessels as the British approached Ticonderoga. To defend against this onslaught, the French commander, the Marquis de Montcalm, planned a defensive line across the peninsula, a simple breastwork of felled trees covered by an abattis, the sharpened, tangled tree branches arrayed to face toward the enemy and block their progress. As the British landed their force and began to push inland, the charismatic and competent British second-in-command, Lord Howe, was killed in a skirmish with a lost French patrol, sinking British morale. After advancing toward the French positions, Abercrombie determined to seize the works without waiting for his artillery.
Shortly after noon, on July 8, 1758, the British began their attack, preceded by swarms of light infantry and rangers. Columns of British regulars and American provincials began to throw themselves at the French works. Safely protected behind their breastworks, French soldiers loaded muskets and handed them to marksmen on the parapet, who fired quickly and accurately. Caught in the abattis, the British were cut to pieces. The results of the battle were horrific. By the end of the day, nearly 2,000 British and American soldiers were killed or wounded. Added to the French casualties of nearly 600, it ranked as the bloodiest battle fought in North America until the Mexican-American War of the 1840s.
The engagement seared Ticonderoga's reputation into the collective consciousness of a generation as an unbeatable position, the key to the continent, and it would carry this legacy forward. By 1759, the British, now under the command of General Geoffrey Amherst, massed another 11,000 men to take Carillon, this time prepared for a formal siege. The outnumbered French had orders to delay as long as possible and unleashed a fusillade of fire from their guns and mortars. As the British brought up their artillery and had almost completed their batteries, Amherst received word that the garrison had evacuated. Around 11 o'clock, on the night of July 26, 1759, the southeast corner of Fort Carillon erupted from a fuse the French had set to their powder magazine, rocking the peninsula and eviscerating nearly a quarter of the fort. When the fire was finally under control, Amherst's army marched into Fort Carillon, renaming it Ticonderoga. And by September of 1760, Montreal had fallen and Canada was in the hands of the British. Even still, Ticonderoga remained garrisoned by a token force to help keep open lines of communication unification between the new British province of Quebec and New York. Even before the battles at Lexington and Concord in April of 1775 ignited the American Revolution, Ticonderoga's significance was clearly identified. With the opening of hostilities, the need for cannon was greater than ever, and the colonial governments of both Connecticut and Massachusetts authorized expeditions to capture the fort. Connecticut agents employed the Green Mountain Boys, led by Ethan Allen of what is today Vermont, to undertake the enterprise. And before the assault, they were joined by Benedict Arnold, coming from Massachusetts.
Around 3:30 a.m. on May 10th, Arnold, Allen, and just over 80 men surprised the sentry at the gate and rushed into the parade ground of the fort, shouting, "No quarter!" Not finding any enemy gunfire, they began to haul out the sleeping British soldiers. The garrison's commander, Captain William Delaplace of the 26th Regiment of Foot, was greeted at his door by this unlikely pair of Arnold and Allen, and faced with the reality that he had no option but to surrender.
News of the capture, the first offensive victory by American forces, spread throughout the colonies, boosting American morale. It also provided a springboard for the expansion of the war. In August, the Continental Congress formally authorized an invasion into the province of Quebec. Ticonderoga was the staging point for this ambitious operation. On December 5th, 1775, a 25-year-old Boston bookseller named Henry Knox arrived at Ticonderoga with instructions from General George Washington to finally transport the cannon captured at Ticonderoga and elsewhere to the American army outside Boston. Knox assembled a train of 59 cannon, mortars, and howitzers, as well as flints and lead needed by the army, nearly 60 tons of ordnance. Knox left Ticonderoga with the first guns on December 9th and headed south up Lake George. After a grueling 300-mile trip across frozen rivers and mountains, the noble train of artillery that Knox described to Washington arrived in Framingham, Massachusetts on January 24th, 1776. Once mounted on Dorchester Heights overlooking Boston, the guns proved decisive, and the British evacuated on March 17th. Knox's delivery of cannon may have tipped the balance for Boston, but Americans had foundered in their simultaneous siege of Quebec. The spring thaw brought British reinforcements, and the Americans fell back nearly 300 miles in a matter of weeks. By July 9th, 1776, the first troops and stores began to arrive at Ticonderoga, where a council of war had determined to halt the retreat and make a stand. Congress had appointed General Horatio Gates to command the beleaguered army, setting in motion a flurry of activity. The Carillon battlefield of 1758 was refortified. Pennsylvania soldiers dug new ditches, reinforced crumbling breastworks, and mounted artillery. New redoubts were built along the shores of Lake Champlain. Across the water, Yankee soldiers cleared what the French knew as Cap Diamant, renaming it Mount Independence. It was fortified with miles of earthworks and batteries and armed with dozens of cannon. General Gates also began to instill a greater sense of military discipline. By its peak in late October, this northern army totaled nearly 15,000 soldiers. It was the second largest force in the field after Washington's command, rivaling some of the largest cities in the rebellious colonies. By October, the British under General Guy Carleton advanced south. The British easily captured Crown Point.
But as they approached Ticonderoga on October 28, 1776, they found not the shattered army they had driven out of Canada that spring, but a large force dug in behind extensive fortifications, bristling with artillery and ready for a fight. Facing this and the looming winter, Carleton made the fateful decision to return to Canada. Given the failure of General Washington to hold New York, having been pushed in retreat back across the Jerseys, ending the year on the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware River, the successful defense of Ticonderoga in 1776 had saved the Revolution.
After a long winter, General Arthur St. Clair returned to take command in June of 1777 and found the garrison substantially weaker, but still charged with defending the same extensive fortifications. Within days, St. Clair received intelligence that another British expedition was venturing south. Under the command of General John Burgoyne, nearly 10,000 British, German, Native American, and loyal colonial subjects advanced up Lake Champlain, hoping to reach Albany and cut the rebellion in half. Arriving at Crown Point on June 25th, the British began to approach the American lines. Their advance guard landed at 3 Mile Point in sight of Ticonderoga on July 1st. Skirmishing by British scouts and Native Americans drew the first shots of the expected siege. But prior to the appearance of the British troops, the Americans made the decision to consolidate on Mount Independence and moved artillery, men, and supplies to the Vermont shore. The American rear guard at Ticonderoga kept pressure on the British while this was underway.
Meanwhile, British soldiers began to cut a road that would ultimately bring up the artillery to seal Ticonderoga's fate. Against all expectation, they succeeded hauling cannon to the top of Mount Defiance, overlooking the narrows of Lake Champlain. From here, they began to construct a battery that could ultimately open fire on Ticonderoga from above. Given his limited provisions and the amount of troops, and knowing the strength of enemy positions, St. Clair summoned a council of war in the evening of July 5th. Given all of the possibilities, his officers agreed to support an evacuation of the post, which began early in the morning of July 6th, 1777.
With news of the evacuation, the British advance guard sprung into action, nipping at the heels of the evacuating American troops as the defenses collapsed. Within hours, the fortresses at Ticonderoga had fallen to the British. For Americans, it signaled another low point in the war. But by preserving the army, St. Clair ensured that his Continentals would fight again. On September 18th, American militia launched a surprise operation to envelop Ticonderoga. One wing, under the command of Colonel John Brown, met with initial success, capturing fully half the British 53rd Regiment and freeing hundreds of American prisoners. They also seized the guns on Mount Defiance and began a bombardment of the small garrison of the old French fort. Despite its initial success, Brown's attack quickly bogged down. They were unprepared for a formal siege, and the British categorically refused their demands for surrender. By dawn on September 23rd, British scouts determined the Americans were gone. Confirmation reached the garrison on October 20th that Burgoyne had surrendered to American forces near Saratoga, New York. Many of the American soldiers that had evacuated Ticonderoga in July were present to witness the British surrender. Now cut off, the British commander at Ticonderoga decided to pull back to Canada. Setting fire to wooden structures, the British left nothing of value for their adversaries, leaving the storied fortress in ruins. American forces did not return to Ticonderoga, and despite a brief British reoccupation in 1781, the fortresses here remained silent. In 1783, George Washington became perhaps Ticonderoga's first tourist, embarking on a tour of the northern theater of the war in which he had never served, as the Revolution was winding down. After the Revolution, the remains of Fort Ticonderoga were transferred into the hands of the state of New York. By 1803, the grounds of the former military post were transferred by the state jointly to Columbia College, now university, and Union College. In 1820, a private citizen, William Ferris Pell, a merchant in New York, purchased the land from the colleges. Pell fenced in the ruins of the old fort to protect them from scavengers, one of the earliest examples of historic preservation in the nation's history. He built a summer home on the shores of the lake, and by the time of his death in 1840, the structure, known as the Pavilion, was serving as a hotel, welcoming visitors on their tour of the natural and historic wonders visible at Ticonderoga. By the early 20th century, William Ferris Pell's descendants still owned the land, and the ruins continued to attract attention and visitors. In 1908, a meeting between Pell's great-grandson, Stephen H.P. Pell, and his wife, Sarah G.T. Pell, and an English architect named Alfred Bossum spurred the reconstruction of Fort Ticonderoga. Later that year, the Pells and Bossum formally embarked on the reconstruction, beginning one of the first projects of its kind in the country. Open to the public on July 6, 1909, the Fort Ticonderoga Museum has been in operation ever since. The museum has amassed an unparalleled collection of objects recovered from the site, as well as artifacts and archives from around the world that document the experience of war in the 18th century.
Today, it stands as a National Historic Landmark, owned and operated by the Fort Ticonderoga Association, a private, not-for-profit educational organization. We are a living link to the conflicts that have shaped North America and a center for exploring the lessons of the past that continue to echo into the present.